Welcome to the deep dive. Tonight we're sinking our teeth into something truly fascinating. The world of vampires.
Ooh.
But forget the Hollywood heartthrobs. We're going deeper, unearthing the roots of vampire myths, with excerpts from a recent university thesis on the evolution of vampire lore.
Okay.
Think of it as a vampire expert's cheat sheet.
It's going to be quite a journey, exploring how these ancient tales originated and how they've wormed their way into our modern culture.
Our mission, to uncover the truth behind the myths, from their ancient origins to their surprising evolution. Are you ready to delve into the dark heart of vampire lore?
Absolutely, and you might be surprised to learn that the vampires of folklore are far more terrifying than the suave creatures we see on screen.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Did you know that traces of vampire myths can be found as far back as ancient Rome?
Yes, there are accounts of these chilling creatures, called strige, described as owl-like beings that swoop down in the night, targeting their victims' chests and drinking their blood. Imagine the terror people must have felt, especially without the scientific understanding we have today.
It's easy to see how those gruesome tales could take hold in a time when sudden deaths and illnesses were shrouded in mystery. But Eastern Europe is really where vampire lore explodes, particularly in countries like Romania and Serbia. Why do you think that is?
Eastern Europe at the time was a region steeped in superstition. The thesis points to the fact that sudden deaths, plagues, and other unexplainable events were rampant, and people were desperate for explanations. The vampire myth provided a scapegoat, a supernatural entity to blame for the chaos and suffering.
It's a fascinating example of how folklore emerges from a need to make sense of the world around us. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What did these folkloric vampires actually look like? I'm picturing something a lot less glamorous than the vampires we see in movies and TV shows.
Oh, absolutely. Forget the brooding, handsome figures of fiction. Folkloric vampires were truly the stuff of nightmares. They were often described as ghostly figures, with long, unkempt hair, clad in white robes, and sometimes even sporting beards. And in some tales, they could shapeshift into animals, like cats or dogs, adding another layer of fear to their already terrifying image.
Okay, that is officially creepy. And the thesis mentions some particularly strange beliefs, too, like the Kosovo gypsy belief that pumpkins and watermelons could transform into vampires after 10 days.
Watermelons?
Watermelon.
Oh, really?
Yes, it sounds outlandish to us, but these beliefs highlight just how deep-seated the fear of vampires was and the length people went to explain the unexplained. They saw danger lurking everywhere, even in the most mundane objects.
So we've talked about the looks. But what about the cravings? It's not just about blood, right? I'm curious about these psychic vampires mentioned in the thesis. Yes. The concept of a creature that could drain you of your emotional energy, your very life force, was a common theme in vampire folklore. It points to a different kind of vulnerability, a fear that went beyond the physical threat of being bitten.
That's like the original energy vampire, and we still use that term today for people who leave us feeling emotionally drained.
Exactly.
That coworker who sucks the energy out of the room just by walking in. Maybe they are a vampire. Just kidding.
And some folklore suggests that these psychic vampires weren't content with feeding on individual misery. They actually caused droughts, harsh winters, even plagues, all to feast on the collective suffering of entire communities.
Wow, talk about a toxic personality. It seems like our ancestors were really looking for someone to blame for their misfortune. But with all these threats lurking in the shadows, what were people doing to protect themselves? Was it all crucifixes and garlic?
Well, garlic was definitely the go-to vampire repellent. The thesis describes how people rubbed it on everything. Corpses, windows, even chimneys. They believed that its pungent odor would banish evil.
It makes sense. I can't imagine anything living or dead wanting to come near that smell. But garlic wasn't the early weapon, was it?
No, there are all sorts of fascinating practices. People believed thorny plants like hawthorn and acacia could keep vampires at bay, and a grafted tree, where two different species are joined together, that was like the ultimate vampire shield.
A grafted tree. Why was that so special?
In folklore, the merging of different life forces in a grafted tree was seen as powerful magic, something a vampire wouldn't dare cross.
It's like nature's own monster repellent. But of course, sometimes prevention wasn't enough. What about those more, shall we say, proactive methods for destroying a vampire? Things are about to get a little intense.
Let's just say they didn't mess around. The classic stake through the heart was a favorite, but it had to be done with specific types of wood, like juniper ash or rosewood, and sometimes a stake alone wasn't enough. Decapitation was also on the table, often followed by stuffing the head with, you guessed it, garlic.
Wow. It seems like they were determined to make absolutely sure those vampires weren't coming back. Do you think this reflects the level of fear surrounding vampires, or was there a symbolic element at play here, a need to completely obliterate something that terrified them?
That's a great question. And it speaks to the complex relationship our ancestors had with the supernatural, but perhaps the most well-known method, and one that persists in vampire lore even today, involves something a little less hands-on.
You're talking about sunlight, right? The vampire's ultimate weakness.
Exactly. Exposure to the sun was believed to incinerate a vampire instantly. This vulnerability to the natural world played a major role in how vampires were depicted. And it continues to be a defining characteristic, even in modern interpretations.
So we've established that vampires were public enemy number one in Eastern European folklore. But how did these terrifying creatures from remote villages end up mingling with the aristocracy in Victorian England? That seems like quite a leap.
That's where the 19th century comes into play, a time of rapid change and societal upheaval. Think about it. Industrialization, a growing divide between rich and poor, anxieties about disease and death. It was a perfect breeding ground for new fears, and the vampire myth, with its themes of parasitism and hidden dangers, fit right in.
It's fascinating how the vampire myth evolved to reflect the anxieties of the time. But instead of just saying it was a breeding ground for new fears, could you give us some specific examples of how those anxieties manifested in the vampire myth?
Absolutely. Imagine living in London during a cholera outbreak. The fear of invisible deadly forces spreading through the population. It's not hard to see how the image of a vampire, preying on the life force of its victims, leaving them weak and drained, would resonate deeply with people.
It's like the anxieties of the modern world were projected onto these ancient creatures, giving them a whole new life in literature.
Exactly. And Gothic literature, with its fascination with the macabre, crumbling castles, and the exploration of darker human impulses, became the perfect playground for the vampire myth to take root and flourish.
Ah, yes. Gothic literature, for those who might not be familiar, can you tell us a little more about what defines this genre and how it lent itself so well to vampire fiction?
Of course. Gothic literature often features elements of mystery, horror, and the supernatural. Think gloomy atmospheres, haunted houses, and characters grappling with psychological torment. These themes created a fertile ground for exploring the darker side of human nature, making it the perfect backdrop for tales of vampires and other creatures that prey on our fears.
Yeah, that's where John Polidori comes in, right? His novella, The Vampire, changed the game, introducing us to the aristocratic vampire and the more shambling corpses. Now we have Lord Ruthven, this charming and ruthless figure, who becomes the prototype for so many vampire characters to come.
Polidori's work was groundbreaking. It took the raw material of Eastern European folklore and gave it a sophisticated, almost seductive veneer. And by placing his vampire in the heart of London society, he tapped into a very real fear, the idea that danger could lurk beneath the surface of even the most civilized facade. Polidori's vampire is fascinating because he's attractive, even seductive. Does that make him more or less terrifying than those monstrous figures from folklore?
Is there something unsettling about a monster that can blend in with society, even charm us? I think it makes it even more terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it challenges our ability to discern friend from foe.
Precisely. And it set the stage for one of the most influential vampire tales of all time, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
So we've seen how vampire myths evolved from ancient Rome to Eastern Europe, but it's really in the 19th century that things get interesting. Yeah. Enter Bram Stoker and his iconic novel Dracula, which took those folkloric elements and, well, let's just say he ran with them.
Dracula was published in 1897, almost 80 years after The Vampire. What made Stoker's interpretation of the vampire so different, so enduring?
That's a great question. What was it about Stoker's approach that captured the public's imagination and continues to fascinate us even today?
Stoker was a master storyteller. He skillfully wove together those threads of folklore, that primal fear of the unknown, into a narrative that was both terrifying and strangely alluring. And his Count Dracula, inspired by the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, is such a complex character, both monstrous and charismatic.
You almost feel a tinge of sympathy for him at times, even while he's preying on innocent victims. But let's break down some of those specific folkloric elements that Stoker used in Dracula. The thesis highlights several key connections. What stood out to you?
Well, the blood drinking, of course, is central to the story. Stoker's descriptions of Dracula feasting on Lucy and Mina, leaving those telltale marks, draining their vitality, it's incredibly vivid and disturbing. It directly echoes those folkloric accounts of vampires feeding on their victims, leaving them weak and drained.
Right, it's not just a physical attack. There's this sense that he's stealing their very essence, their life force. It's a violation that goes beyond the physical realm.
And the shape-shifting. Dracula's ability to transform into a bat, a wolf, even a mist. This comes straight from Eastern European folklore. It heightened his mystique, his ability to move unseen, to be everywhere and nowhere at once.
It plays into that primal fear of the predator, the creature that can blend into the shadows, always watching, always waiting. But there's something almost poetic about it too, don't you think? The way he can become these creatures of the night, these symbols of wildness and freedom.
That's an interesting observation. It speaks to the duality of the vampire myth, the way it can both repel and attract us. And then there's Dracula's power over nature, controlling storms, summoning wolves, even those creepy rats.
Those abilities, while frightening, also had a certain allure, a sense of power beyond human comprehension. It's almost like he embodies the untamed forces of nature that we both fear and revere.
Exactly. But he wasn't completely invincible, right? Nature also held some power over him.
Absolutely. Stoker cleverly wove in those folkloric weaknesses too. Sunlight, running water, the need for an invitation to enter a home. These limitations made Dracula more believable, more grounded in those ancient beliefs. Do you think those constraints actually make him a more compelling character?
I think they do. By giving Dracula vulnerabilities, Stoker made him more relatable, more human in a way. It creates this tension, this constant battle between the supernatural and the natural world.
And speaking of battling, we can't forget about Van Helsing. He's more than just a vampire hunter. He's like the embodiment of folklore knowledge, the one who understands the ancient rules of this fight. He's the guy you call when you've got a vampire problem.
He is. And the thesis points out how Van Helsing blends Western medicine with ancient wisdom to fight Dracula. He's a bridge between the rational and the supernatural.
The thesis highlighted some of the specific remedies he uses that were taken straight from folklore. It's like he carries a vampire hunting toolkit, passed down through generations.
Garlic, of course, is his go-to weapon. He uses it to protect Lucy, to ward off Dracula, even to fill Lucy's mouth after she's slain. And the wild roses he places on her coffin, that was another classic folkloric symbol of protection against evil.
It's as if he's a walking encyclopedia of vampire lore. But it wasn't just about ancient remedies, right? He also used religious artifacts. The power of faith to combat Dracula?
Yes, the crucifix, the host holy water. These were all part of Van Helsing's arsenal. It highlights an important theme in Dracula, the idea that faith, both religious and in those ancient beliefs, could be a powerful force against evil.
So from ancient origins to Victorian England, the vampire myth took quite a journey. It's incredible how these creatures evolved to reflect the fears and fascinations of different cultures and time periods. But what I find particularly interesting is this concept of the psychic vampire that we touched on earlier. The idea that someone can drain you of your energy, your very life force, without ever laying a finger on you. Do you think there's a modern-day equivalent to this idea?
Absolutely. We still talk about energy vampires today, those people who leave us feeling emotionally drained and exhausted after spending time with them. It's that feeling of being depleted, like something has been taken from you.
It's like the emotional equivalent of a vampire bite. But this brings us to the thesis's final provocative question. We've explored the external threats of vampires, the blood drinking, the shape-shifting, the lurking in the shadows. But what about the internal vampires? Could this myth be a metaphor for something darker within ourselves?
It's a fascinating question, and one that I think speaks to the enduring power of the vampire myth. Now, the thesis doesn't spend much time unpacking this, but I'm curious, could this whole vampire myth be a giant metaphor? Are we really talking about something darker, lurking inside all of us?
I love that idea. Think about it. Those classic vampire traits, the thirst for power, the manipulation, the exploitation of others, those aren't just monstrous qualities. They're all too human, aren't they?
It's true. We see these traits play out in the real world all the time. In toxic relationships, in abusive power dynamics, in the way people can use and manipulate others for their own gain.
Maybe the vampire myth gives us a safe way to confront those darker aspects of ourselves, those impulses we usually try to keep hidden. It allows us to explore those uncomfortable truths in a way that feels less threatening.
Exactly. The vampire becomes this larger-than-life symbol of our own potential for selfishness, for craving things that ultimately harm others. It's like a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most civilized among us can harbor these dangerous desires, and that the line between monster and human is often thinner than we'd like to believe.
So maybe the real fight against the vampire isn't about garlic and steaks and crucifixes. Maybe it's about recognizing and confronting those darker impulses within ourselves before they take control.
Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of the vampire myth. It's not just about external threats lurking in the shadows. It's about acknowledging the shadows within each of us and finding ways to manage them, to prevent them from consuming us.
So there you have it, folks. From ancient origins to Victorian anxieties and modern-day metaphors, the vampire myth is a journey through folklore, literature, and ultimately the human psyche. It's a story that continues to fascinate and terrify us, precisely because it reflects something back at us, something both alluring and unsettling.
And it leaves us with more questions than answers, which is perhaps the most intriguing aspect of it all.
That's what makes these deep dives so compelling. We've unearthed the roots of the vampire myth, traced its evolution through centuries of storytelling, and hopefully left you with some food for thought. What aspects of the vampire myth resonate most with you? What internal monsters do you think it might represent? Until next time, keep a light on. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we carry within.